Hi, I'm Samuel Hollywood Summers. I'm a composer based in Exeter in the UK, and I'm currently working on a project called Emotional Response, which is a generative piece of music which is taking the audience members' emotions and turning that into music that matches those emotional states that they come to the piece of music with, representing that sonically through music, through sound. Now, what I'm going to do today is continue with this project. There is a previous vlog. If you haven't seen that, have a look, maybe catch up before you watch the rest of this. There'll also be a link to the playlist of all of the episodes down below, so if you're watching this in the future you can watch the whole lot. But basically what I'm going to do today is start creating that generative music system. What we're going to be doing is setting up the project in FMOD, which is a audio middleware piece of software which is often used with computer games in order to take the music or the sound effects that have been created and have them respond dynamically dependent on game states. Now, for us, what's going to change dynamically in this project is the emotions of the last person to interact with the camera, providing the input to the system, which is the facial expression, and then from there that will be converted by some code into a variable with a value linked to each individual emotion. And what I want to do then is have that affect what's happening in the music system, the generative music system. What we're going to be looking at is the FMOD project that is going to basically have the rules of the generative music system underpinning this, and I'm going to show you the prototype, the early stages of this working. Now eventually the piece will be quite complex and have lots of generative process happening within it, but today I'm just going to show you the progress up to the point of kind of a proof of concept. What we have here is my FMOD project. So what I've got is 7 different loop regions, one for each emotion, and from left to right and from 0 to 6. So right at the very left we have our neutral emotion loop. If I start to play this, you will hear the neutral loop. Okay, so the piece of music that I have here at the moment is placeholder. I decided this wasn't quite happy, wasn't quite sad, wasn't hugely dramatic. The piece is called softly dramatic, but at the same time it's emotionally ambiguous rather than neutral perhaps. So I'm going to approach this differently eventually. But as you can see, what I've got here, we have the loop region here. We'll go over what this is in a moment. We also have 6 different, what we're calling transition regions. Now, how I'm getting this piece of music to be generative and interactive and responsive is that if certain criteria are hit, then it will trigger a transition to one of the other loop regions. Now, I'll stop this playing for a moment. Further over to the right, we have a happiness loop, we have a surprise loop, we have a sadness loop, we have a fear loop, an anger loop quite short, and a disgust loop. So this is how I'm dividing up the emotions. I have also attached a variable to emotion. I've got a variable called emotion, which you can see here in this part of the screen. Now this goes from 0 to 6 and is discrete data, meaning it's only whole numbers, it's only specific values, and in this case is whole numbers. 0 is for the neutral emotion at the far left, meaning that happiness would be 1, surprise is 2, sadness is 3, and so on. So if I was to play this again, we start at the value of 0, so we start with the neutral music. And how I've set this up is that if the value of the variable changes, what plays changes. The playhead that you can see, if I get the right part of the screen on, this playhead will transition to the correct cue, the correct loop section. So if I change this to 1, it doesn't happen immediately, but then we transition to this much happier, groovy music. So we started playing with the value of 0, and if I change that to 1, the next time it hits one of these lines, it transitions. So what these lines are the quantization of the transition regions. So we have one specific transition region here, which I'll show you now, called 2 happiness loop. So this region is triggering a transition to the happiness loop, which starts here. This blue loop region is the target for this green transition region. But the transition region, I've set the quantization interval to 1 bar. If I didn't have a quantization region, as soon as the emotion variable reaches the value 1, it would instantly transition into the happiness loop. And the reason it transitions to the happiness loop is because I have this condition set up here. We can add a new one. So add condition, add parameter condition, and you can select your parameter from a list. We've already got a parameter condition for emotion, so it's not showing up, but that's how I added this. And then it also gives you options, so you can have the full range of values, or you can set it to be the correct conditions that you actually want. So the to happiness loop will only trigger a transition if the emotion variable is equal to 1. If it was equal to something else, then it wouldn't trigger this transition region, but I've got 5 other transition regions set up, all with the same quantization interval of 1 bar, but we've got one for surprise. You can see here the only difference is the emotion condition. The variable is between the ranges of 2 to 2, so basically just the value of 2 will trigger a transition to the surprise loop. To sadness loop would trigger a transition to the sadness loop, but only if the emotion variable is equal to 3, and so on. And I've set these up for each of the loops so that there are 6 different transitions to the 6 other different loop regions. Okay, so it's just really simple sort of programming or logic that triggers a transition only given certain conditions. And you can see that these green lines are different distances from each other depending on the beats per minute, the tempo of each of these different pieces of music. As I said about the neutral loop, that is placeholder. So these are just pieces of music I already had that vaguely fit to each of the emotions. I tend to write music that is quite emotionally complex or ambiguous or not entirely clear. For this project, it'll be different. So I'm going to be replacing these WAV files, these very fixed, unchanging, not very generative loops. I'm going to change them with more generative music processes, and that's what the next few episodes of this vlog will be about. But for now, if I start the music, so it just plays from wherever the playhead is, transitions to the section that's relevant to the current value of the variable. You can change that to 6, and it goes to disgust. At the moment, I've just got some weird, kind of abrasive loop there. Change to 5. This is anger, so at the moment it's just like really badly played, overdriven guitar. I think it puts across the emotion of anger quite well. 4, I think this was fear I decided on. Yes, this is playing the fear loop. If we change it to 2, so go back to the surprise loop. So here we've got some sort of kind of upbeat music. It's not simply happy, but it's got to have the element of unpredictability or surprise. So this one's in a 7/8 meter. I might use that approach for the surprise music that we actually have in the final version. I might not. This was made for a game jam, for a really upbeat, fun, silly game. Then 3 is sadness. Okay, so this is just illustrative of how I'm going to have the overall program work underneath the hood. So nobody's going to see this when the installation is actually happening. What they're going to notice is what's changing about the music as their facial expressions change. So at the moment this isn't connected up with any other software, but it is going to have the input. What they're going to interact with is a camera that's pointed at them, like a webcam, and it's going to detect their face, and from that it's just going to change what sounds they're hearing. So there's no visual representation of this FMOD project. This will be hidden away. By the time that the piece is finished, it's going to be a lot more complicated than this. I'm not just going to have the one variable and the one thing that's changing, as in play this loop or play this loop or play this loop. This is just a very simple sort of scaffolding, the foundation that's going to end up being built upon in order to create the piece itself. Now I'm going to show you another FMOD project now, which will be closer to how I envisage this emotional response project working when it's finished. So we've got a harp playing chords, we've got a flute playing melodies, and we've got a bass playing bass lines. And by randomizing the bass line and randomizing the flute, we end up with what you're going to see now. One of a selection of melodies will play, one of a selection of bass lines will play. The chord sequence is always constant, and what you end up with is something that feels a bit more dynamic, and it feels a bit open-ended, more generative, where all you're really doing is choosing at random between a few options. So this is the kind of another approach I can bring to my generative project, Emotional Response. What I will say is that some combinations of bassline and melody work together and some work less well. So yeah, what you can see here, it's highlighting the particular audio file that it's playing. So here we're playing this particular flute line, and when it gets to the end and loops back, it plays a different one. The same's happening with the bass lines. I've got more flute melodies than I have bass lines. There's 5 bass lines and 1, 2, 3, how many of these are there? I think if I double click, can I see them all? Oh, if I click once I can see them all. So yeah, I've got, wow, quite a few flute solos to choose from. I'm just sort of getting drawn back into this. I've not listened to it for a while. What I've also done that can probably demonstrate what is possible with emotional response is I have a dreaminess variable. As I bring this up, it adds reverb to the flute. Oh, and delay, it seems. Here we go, yep, so you can see here that there is delay and more delay that's added. So if I change the value of the dreaminess down a little, then you start to hear more and more of it. What you've just seen there is a couple more examples of how I'm going to bring more generative processes into this project by having different melodies or different samples or different field recordings to choose from, where you're bringing in another random element, another aleatoric process. You can have other variables that end up with specific outcomes. So there could be something else about how I want the music to feel and to behave depending on the emotion, or it could be to do with something like the percentage of confidence that my facial expression recognition code has in its choice in its identification of the emotion. So if it kicks out the value of happiness, it will play the happy section of the piece of music. It won't just be that simple disco loop that you've heard. It will have these kind of aleatoric processes going on. There will be new instruments that are designed to feel happy that I've made. There will be new melodic and ideas, more musical motifs and gestures. But these will be determined by some randomness. They will also potentially have reliance on other parameters that I might bring in. I haven't yet fully designed how I want each emotion to be expressed in music. I haven't designed how I want the generative processes to behave. I can bring in these randomness kind of approaches. I can also have a a different parameter affect something like reverb, something like delay, a different effect that I might want to bring. One thing that I might want is that if I end up bringing in anger, if there's a low value of anger, so say the software, the facial recognition software, identifies an emotion of anger, but it's maybe with like a 60% confidence, or it's not totally clear that it's anger, I can play the anger loop. But then the more confident the software is in that anger identification, we could add something like a really heavy distortion, or we can have the piece chopped up and rearranged, or just completely obliterated through processing that can be reliant on that variable. I might also want to have different triggers within the environment that this installation is in. So if somebody presses a button that's out in there, maybe there are a few prompts to press keys on the laptop if I'm using the laptop and its camera, or I could have external input devices specifically made for this project. However that happens, it could trigger its own thing. Now at the moment, in the main FMOD project, everything happens within one event, but I can have new events created if a specific thing happens, which could be interesting. FMOD is middleware for computer game development. So what happens is that a sound designer or a composer would use this software to design all of the behaviors they want to see from the audio, from the music, and it makes it easier then as a sort of a go-between for the game designer or game programmer and the sound person or sound team to then bring their work together. And what could be a nice, interesting outcome for this project is, especially now that we're in lockdown, I'm not actually able to be at Collider where I'm resident at the moment, technically, on paper. I do my work from home. What might be nice is to create some sort of environment in Unity, like a game, an interactive environment where the emotions of the character, or I could overcomplicate things. I could create an entire game around it and have the character's emotion influence the music. Maybe that's like further down the road. But I could have an environment where a different room represents a different emotion and is filled with objects or images of, that are evocative of those emotions that are associated with happiness, with sadness, with anger, with disgust. And when you're in that environment, perhaps then it will start playing the music that's relevant to that specific emotion. And I could have different interactions happening within that environment, trigger one-off sounds or events or so on that are separate to and in addition to the main music loop that's going on in the background. So these are some ideas. I'm not really sure where the creative process will lead me entirely, but I do have ideas for what I want for each individual emotion, and I'm going to show you what I do, my experiments, the results of my experiments and my decisions that I come to as we move forward with the project. One thing I said I would go back to is tempo markers, so let's open up the relevant project. Okay, so we're back to the main project, the emotional response project. I said that I wanted to show you these little things here. Now, let's get to the relevant section. We're playing the neutral loop. The marker, the little thing that you see here, has a little crotchet saying equals 78 44 4/4. So this crotchet equals 78 is telling us that this loop is in 78 beats per minute. Before putting all of these loops into FMOD, I went and had a look back at the logic sessions and wrote down all the beats per minute for each of these pieces, so that I could make sure these loop regions and these transition regions could all be the right length and everything could work nice and easily, so that we can have these transitions, these quantization intervals at actual, what is a genuine bar length. So yeah, that's really helped out. This particular loop is in 4/4. We also have sections which are not in 4/4. Happiness is in 4/4. It's pretty fast, 204 beats per minute. Probably possible to count it as 102 beats per minute as well. But there you go. Where do we get the interesting one? I think it's surprise. Here we go, yep. So surprise is in 7/8. It might be the only odd meter piece. But yeah, so long as you you know and understand a bit of music theory, this comes in really handy when you're trying to bring your music into an FMOD project. Okay, so now I've shown you where I'm up to at the moment. The next steps are going to be to plan out how I actually want the music to behave, design those systems for each individual emotion. I probably won't use the same approach for every single emotion. And what I'm doing is populating what I'm calling the emotional matrix, which I've got just a Google Sheets document where for each of the 7 emotions I'm exploring, I'm putting down sort of different timbres, different instruments, different types of melodies, different harmonies that are appropriate to that particular emotion, and different ways that I can evoke those particular emotions in the music. So I'm really going to dig deep into that next. What I'll probably do is explore each emotion in a vlog so that you can watch how I approach happiness, how I approach sadness, disgust, which, as we discussed last time, I'm a bit daunted by. I think it's going to be really interesting and really challenging to distinguish between disgust and fear, and really try and have its own sonic identity. I'm also interested in how I'm going to explore anger. I think a lot of males in particular express all of their emotions through anger, and I think that often there's another emotion behind it. So I quite like the idea of, in the music that is expressing anger, that is evoking anger, that I'm willing to sort of allow tinges of sadness, of frustration, of whatever else to also be in there. And because there are no absolute universally accepted dividing lines between emotions and between music that expresses one emotion or another, this is going to be really quite subjective, and it is going to be interesting, an interesting exercise for me deciding what I do and don't want to use to evoke those emotions. So that's the next step. Once I've populated the emotional matrix for the timbres, the approaches that I want to use, I'm actually going to go dig in and actually implement that. So as I showed you today with the sort of flute jam loop approach, this could be appropriate. Some emotions might not suit that kind of rhythmic, melodic, very structured approach. It might be more sort of bleeps and bloops and drones and sound effects. I'm thinking that disgust is going to be a lot easier to evoke with, you know, wet, sloppy, sort of almost like bodily sounds, those kinds of sounds that already evoke some sort of disgust or repulsion response in us, so like fingernails on a chalkboard, all that good stuff. Whereas, yeah, so happiness, I'm going to expect to be very sort of jolly, very melodic. So let's allow this piece of simple generative music to play us out. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to keep up to date with this particular project, Emotional Response, there will be a link in the description to the playlist so you can watch all of the vlogs. If you're watching this now, subscribe and hit the bell and you can be notified whenever I release a new video. If you're watching this in the future, then yes, you could watch the entire playlist of all of the vlogs in succession and binge to your heart's content. Hopefully this turns out as well as I'm hoping it will. You can let me know in the comments sometime in the future. If you have any questions about the project, you can leave them below as well. If you want to, you can brush up on what generative music is and how other people have approached it with my documentary. That'll be linked somewhere on screen. And yeah, thank you and see you in the next vlog.